Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki, Sharma, Upadhyay. Let's get started.
Поджог учебно-тренировочного корпуса. Прибывшими к корпусу
Європа зараз повинна прокинутися. Горить найбільша атомна станція Європи прямо зараз.
A nuclear disaster was averted today. Last night, Russia opened fire on Europe's biggest nuclear plant. Russian forces had surrounded this facility 24 hours back. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, that's the nuclear watchdog of the world, United Nations in fact, had issued repeated warnings. Moscow was urged to keep weapons away from the site. The Russian forces reportedly did not listen. They shelled the nuclear facility and came dangerously close to blowing up a reactor. The world powers knew the risks, and yet they failed to act. Russia has now taken control of this facility. The threat is not over. Kiev says Moscow is engaging in nuclear terrorism. Russia says it did not attack, that it was an act of Ukrainian sabotage. Whatever be the story, any mishap at this facility will unleash a nuclear disaster that, according to Ukraine, could be 10 times more powerful than Chernobyl. Will the West still hedge its bets? Will the world leave Ukraine to its fate, just like it did with Afghanistan? On Gravitas tonight, we will discuss. Day 9 of the Ukraine invasion, our worst fears are coming true. Nuclear plants are coming under attack. We told you about this yesterday, about the threat of a nuclear disaster. Yesterday, Russian forces surrounded Europe's biggest nuclear plant. The world repeatedly warned Moscow that under no circumstances should a nuclear plant be targeted. But the Russian forces apparently did not listen. Look at these CCTV videos. Can you see the flashes? That's the forces shelling the Zaporizhia nuclear plant. Soon enough, a fire broke out. Blasts at the site lit up the night sky. Thankfully, the fire was contained. None of the active reactors was harmed. But can the world afford to take these chances? There are no two ways about this. Nuclear plants cannot become battlegrounds because even a minor mishap will lead to a major nuclear catastrophe, a disaster bigger than Chernobyl and Fukushima. Ukraine is already accusing Russia of nuclear terrorism. Is Moscow playing Russian roulette with a nuclear plant? On Gravitas tonight, we will bring you the full story. First, let's tell you what happened at the plant. Russian troops shelled this nuclear plant in southern Ukraine last night. Later, they took control of the site. The fire broke out at a training building. The world came dangerously close to a nuclear disaster. Reports say one of the 6 reactors caught fire here. But it was under renovation. It was not operating. Only one reactor is running at this facility right now, so a major calamity has been averted. Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, was quick to raise an alarm. Dressed in military fatigues, he urged the West to wake up.
Europe has to wake up now. Europe's largest nuclear power plant is on fire. At this very moment, Russian tanks are shooting at nuclear reactor blocks. These are tanks equipped with thermal vision devices, so they know where they are shooting. They were prepared for this.
The Ukrainian foreign minister shared some specifics. He said the Russian army fired on the plant from all sides. Let me quote from his statement. If it blows up, it will be 10 times larger than Chernobyl. Russians must immediately cease the fire, allow firefighters, establish a security zone. Earlier today, we saw firefighters at the scene. They doused the fire, but the world panicked. We can think of multiple reasons why. Number one, the facility itself, it cannot guard itself against a full-scale war. Those who built this complex, this nuclear facility, perhaps never factored the threat of a war. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant was built during the Soviet era. That's when Ukraine was still part of the Soviet Union. The reactors were built out in the open and not underground. That's where they stand today. And that's why they're vulnerable to attacks. Reason number two, the reactors are quite old. Some of them were designed and built half a century ago in the 1970s. Now, usually any reactor is said to have a lifespan of 40 years. So these reactors are already running beyond their expiry date. They still supply electricity, but they may not be strong enough to survive Russian bullets. Reason number three, and perhaps the biggest worry, is what Russia is doing. They're conducting military operations around this facility, even when the threat is obvious. What is Moscow's defense? It denies the attack. It calls an attack an act of Ukrainian sabotage.
Leaving the building, a Ukrainian sabotage group set fire to the training building. The fire brigades that arrived at the building put the fire out of the premises. At the time of the provocation, none of the full-time employees of the power plant was in the training building. Currently, the staff of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant continues to work as usual, maintains the power plant facilities and monitors the radioactive situation. The radioactive background in the area of the nuclear power plant is normal.
So Russia denies attacking the nuclear facility and now claims full control of it. A nuclear catastrophe, like we've been saying, has been averted. What happens next? Will the West send troops to protect nuclear facilities? Can it ensure that nuclear reactors are not caught in the crossfire? US President Joe Biden spoke with Zelensky. All he could come up with a statement in support of Ukraine. Biden has urged Russia to cease military activities near the site. Boris Johnson, meanwhile, wants an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council. The European Union is promising more sanctions on Russia. So here's what you have: condemnation, emergency meetings and sanctions, basically more of the same, and clearly not enough to stop the war. The Ukrainians have realized that they are on their own here. Many turned up near the nuclear plant to try to stop the Russian forces. We haven't been able to verify when this happened. These locals are also building barriers with tires, vehicles and metal. In fact, one of the barricades is so large, even satellites in space can see it. These are acts of courage in a war that Ukraine has a very slim chance of surviving. That's because week 2 of this war has seen a different strategy. The Russian blitzkrieg has clearly failed. This is now a battle of attrition. More airstrikes, more shelling, more deployments. Russia is looking to demoralize Ukrainians, basically bomb them into submission. 5 cities are on Russia's radar: Kiev, Kharkiv, Mariupol, Cherniv and Odessa. All 5 are under constant bombardment. We'll start with Kiev. Earlier this week, we told you about a Russian convoy about 64 kilometers long, 20 kilometers from Kiev. Where is that convoy now? It's still there. US intelligence says the convoy has stalled. They're facing 2 major problems: stiff local resistance and major logistical issues. In the meantime, Russia is softening Kiev's defenses. How? With targeted bombing. This is what the city's suburbs look like right now. Take a look. As we move further into the city, the scenes change. The roads are dotted with these strange-looking metal structures. They're called hedgehogs. What do? Hedgehogs are basically anti-tank barricades. They can halt or at least slow Russian military vehicles. So Kiev is bracing for the endgame. It is not a question of if the convoy arrives, it's a question of when. And right now, Ukraine is doing its best to delay the inevitable. Elsewhere, the inevitable is already happening. Cherniv, for instance, is being pounded non-stop. These pictures should tell you how intense the attack is. The roads are littered with debris. Cars have been reduced to sheets of metal. Buildings have been sliced in half. And with every strike, the human cost is mounting. 33 people have died so far. Ukraine says schools and houses are being targeted. You can imagine what it's like in the city. Bombs can drop anytime, anywhere, and that's exactly what happens in this next video.
Пиздец.
Something similar is happening in Mariupol. Now, this is a strategically important city, Mariupol. It is located on the Sea of Azov. Right now, Russian forces have besieged it. There are reports of massive food and drug shortages. What's worse, there is constant bombardment. Take a look at these apartment buildings. They were targeted by Russian strikes. You can see fires burning at the ground level. The whole building is clouded in smoke, much like these buildings in Kharkiv. Now, this city, Kharkiv, was supposed to be an easy conquest for Russia. It is made up of Russian speakers, plus it is close to the Russian border. Instead, Kharkiv is putting up a spirited resistance. But Russia is not backing down. Their strategy is ruthless. The more you resist, the more we bomb. And this is the aftermath of those bombings. We've told you about 4 cities, Kiev, Kharkiv, Chernihiv and Mariupol. All 4 are being pounded by missiles. All 4 are being encircled by Russia. Yet all 4 are in Ukrainian control. And that may change over the weekend. But for now, the Ukrainian soldiers stand resolute. What about the Russian soldiers? What is their next target? According to some reports, this port on the Black Sea, Odessa, it is the 3rd largest city in Ukraine. If you capture Odessa, you can cut Ukraine off from the sea. The question is, how do you reach Odessa? Here's what US intelligence says. Russia is planning an amphibious landing. What does that mean? That Russian warships are planning to ferry soldiers to Odessa, basically land them on the beach. Is there any proof of this plan? Many experts point to this video. It was shot from Western Crimea. What you're looking at are Russian amphibious ships. Reports say they're now heading to Odessa. How is Ukraine preparing for this amphibious assault? They're fortifying the beach with sandbags and hedgehogs. Now, amphibious landings are extremely risky. Some, like Gallipoli, have ended in utter disaster. Others, like Normandy, eventually led to success. So we'll have to see how Odessa plays out. And where does that leave diplomacy? As more of a showpiece, you could say. On Thursday, Russian and Ukrainian officials held the second round of talks. The pictures were telling. The Ukrainian side turned up in green overalls. The Russian delegates were fully suited. Did they make any progress? Both sides agreed to establish a humanitarian corridor. They agreed to let citizens leave peacefully. But on the battlefront, there was no progress, no indications of a ceasefire. So Ukraine is turning elsewhere. They're asking NATO to enforce a no-fly zone over the country, over Ukraine. What does that mean? A no-fly zone is an area controlled by a military power. Nobody else can enter it. If they do, they can be shot down. Kiev wants NATO to establish this zone over Ukraine, a no-fly zone, but NATO's reply was clear. This is not our war.
The reason why that has not been a step the president has been willing to take or we have been interested in taking is because a no-fly zone requires implementation. It would require essentially the U.S. military shooting down Russian planes and prompting a potential direct war with Russia, the exact step that we want to avoid.
NATO foreign ministers did meet in Brussels today. Their agenda was as expected. More sanctions, more military assistance, anything that keeps them out of the battle. Last Friday, Russian soldiers had entered the outskirts of Kiev. The city was expected to fall over the weekend. 7 days later, Kiev stands resolute. So we cannot be sure what's in store this weekend. All we can say is this: do not underestimate the Ukrainian resistance. To discuss these developments and more, I'm being joined by my colleagues, our correspondents Anas Malik from Lviv in Ukraine, Nick Harper from Washington, D.C., Julia Chapman from Moscow, and Rosie Burchard from Brussels. Good evening to all of you, and thank you for joining me. Anas, let's start with you. You are in Ukraine. What's the situation like in Lviv? You landed there this morning. Tell us about your experience so far.
Well, the situation is pretty grim. There is general dampness or sadness in the air. It's quiet here. But one thing you rightly mentioned, that do not underestimate the Ukrainian resistance, and rightly so, because everybody who I've met, they're putting their boys and even in fact the girls as well to join the Ukrainian resistance. Boys as young as 16, just fresh college graduates. Just a while back I spoke to them, and they were enlisted to join the group of volunteers or militias as we call it, and they are to pick up the weapons from tomorrow onwards. They vow that they will be protecting all inches of their land, come what may. They are angry at the international community by and large for two things. One, they say that the international community needs to up its effort into supporting the Ukrainian people, A, and B, the fact that the international community woke up very late into supporting the Ukrainian people. This should have been done much earlier. Whatever that is being done right now for support, this should have been done much earlier in the run-up to this invasion. Palki?
Anas, Lviv is one of the few centres and one of the few cities that has managed to escape this war. It has become a shelter of sorts for refugees and diplomats and even journalists, a base for war preparations, you could say. Is it expected to remain that way, or is it just a matter of time before Lviv also sees that kind of shelling and bombing? What is the perception on the ground?
Well, the perception on the ground is that it is just a matter of time that things can escalate quite quickly. Just twice in the past 24 hours, we saw those air raid sirens going off. Just as when I arrived last night, that's when the first time when we heard those air raid sirens going off. That means basically you have to leave everything whatever that you are doing and rush to the nearest bomb shelter. That was late last night around 10 p.m. local time. And early morning as well, today in the morning, we saw those air raid sirens. So the perception on the ground is that it's just a matter of time until the war moves from the east towards the west here in the city of towards the city of Lviv. The city is currently considered to be a transit hub or a transit city for those people from elsewhere in the country trying to escape out of the country to Poland, mostly to Poland, because it adjoins to two borders of Poland. One is the Karachowa border and the other is the Medica border from where I crossed in as well. There are lines and lines, long queues of people, about 5 to 7 kilometers at least, one of them which I witnessed at the Medica border. So that actually explains, people say that it's only a matter of time, and the reason they're trying to escape it at the earliest, escape from here at the earliest, so that they can be what they believe is considerably safe. Palki?
Right, Anas, I understand you're standing in sub-zero temperatures, and this is the second war you're covering for us in the last 6 months. Thank you very much for joining this broadcast, and stay safe. Let me go straight to Washington, D.C. Nick, Joe Biden has urged Russia to provide firefighters access to Ukraine's nuclear site. The US president has made some statements. American troops, more troops, have landed in Eastern Europe. What can you tell us about these developments and America's evolving strategy?
That's right. The US president still pushing hard on this path for diplomacy. We know that he had a late-night phone call with Volodymyr Zelensky after we saw the attack on the nuclear plant. The two leaders speaking, both urging in a statement that the White House put out afterwards for firefighters to be allowed access to the plant. More troops also going, and we know that within the next 45 minutes or so, President Biden will be speaking to the president of Poland, looking at ways that they can assist each other in the ongoing situation. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, also on his way to Poland. He's currently in Brussels for the meeting with NATO and the G7 foreign ministers, but he'll be heading to Poland next, and then another 4 European countries over the course of the weekend. So the US is doing what it can in terms of diplomacy, but at this stage it is clearly still in a holding pattern as to what it can do. We have seen more sanctions over the last 24 hours targeting oligarchs in particular. The US today, Friday, hasn't announced any new sanctions, but we have seen really measures coming out day by day, and there is the possibility of more as things develop here in Washington during the course of the day.
Julia, Moscow has put its nuclear forces on alert. The UN says this is a serious escalation. And Russia, of course, denies attacking the nuclear reactor in Ukraine. What can you tell us about Moscow's position?
The Kremlin insists that the nuclear threat is not being posed by Russia. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, earlier this week said that it was the West that had ideas of nuclear war swirling around its heads. That said, he also earlier, before those comments, said the next world war will likely be a nuclear one. So undoubtedly everybody is watching very closely as to what Russia does, but analysts are saying that putting nuclear forces on alert is really not necessarily the aggressive tactic that it appears. It could just be an attempt to trigger the West, and that the West not putting its forces on alert in return was the right response. So they are trying to reduce the threat of any kind of nuclear conflict. That is part of the reason why NATO has been very reluctant to introduce a no-fly zone over Ukraine, because it is worried that that could involve shooting down a Russian plane and breaking out into a more wide war beyond just the fighting we're seeing in Ukraine.
Rosie, NATO foreign ministers held a meeting in Brussels today. A host of other emergency meetings are also expected to take place. Is anything expected to change with all of this talk?
Well, that meeting of NATO foreign ministers has just wrapped up, but it's really a bumper day of diplomacy here in Brussels. There was then a meeting of G7 foreign ministers and then a meeting of EU foreign ministers with special guests from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada and, of course, Ukraine. Those talks are happening in this building, and ministers have really been looking at the way ahead as this conflict intensifies. There were some reactions of shock and outrage to that news and reports of an attack on a Ukrainian power plant. The NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg said that shows the recklessness of this war. Now, in these talks with EU ministers, we might expect some further coordination on sanctions, ramping up those sanctions further, and of course responding to those acute humanitarian needs on the ground, as more than 1 million people have already fled Ukraine into neighbouring countries, many of them in the European Union.
I'm going to thank all of you for bringing us the updates from the 4 cities. Wars, we know, have always been a numbers game. They're driven by quantity, fought by calculating generals, and often determined by logistical might. Numbers also tell us about the repercussions of war, the impact on economies, businesses, human lives. So if we assess the Ukraine war in numbers, what does it look like? Here's a report.
Let's begin with the basics. Civilian casualties. The exact numbers aren't clear. The UN says 249 civilians have died in Ukraine. 553 have been injured. Very different from Ukraine's figures. It claims over 2,000 civilian casualties. It's hard to verify either version. Next, we have military casualties. Again, the figure varies depending on who you ask. Ukraine says over 9,000 Russian troops have been killed. Russia says it has lost only 498 troops. It also says over 2,800 Ukrainian soldiers have died, and more than 3,700 have been wounded. Ukraine, meanwhile, has not released casualty figures for its armed forces, but it has put out a lot of data on the losses on Russia's side. It says that since the war began, Russia has lost a total of 2 boats, 3 unmanned aerial vehicles, 18 anti-aircraft weapons, 33 planes, 50 multiple rocket launchers, 60 fuel tanks, 105 artillery pieces, 251 tanks, 404 cars, and 939 armed personnel carriers. What about losses on the Ukrainian side? Kiev is silent on this. Russia is not. It claims to have hit 1,812 Ukrainian military facilities, 65 command posts, 56 missile systems, 59 radar stations, 62 aircraft, 635 tanks, 67 multiple rocket launchers, 252 field artillery and mounts, 442 units of special military vehicles, and 54 unmanned aerial vehicles. Next, we have refugees. The United Nations says that more than 1 million people have fled Ukraine. That's almost 2% of the entire population. Where have they gone? Poland, Hungary, Moldova, Slovakia, Romania, Russia, and Belarus. What about Indian nationals? At least 20,000 of them were in Ukraine when war broke out. New Delhi says 18,000 of them have left Ukraine. Many are camping in neighboring countries. 10,500 have reached India. India is sending 80 evacuation flights under Operation Ganga. 30 flights have successfully completed their operations. What's being done to stop this war? 2 ceasefire talks have taken place as the West continues pouring weapons into Ukraine. The US, Canada and the EU have sent weapons worth millions of dollars. The West is also slapping sanctions on Russia. On Friday, the ruble touched a record low of 113 against the dollar, a 30% drop in value since the start of this year. Russian billionaires have lost $80 billion in the last 1 week. Russia has also been denied access to foreign reserves worth $630 billion. As the war enters its 9th day and tensions refuse to die down, these numbers are only expected to rise. Bureau Report, WION The World is One.
You can see.
You've seen the soldiers, you've seen the weapons. Now let's focus on the leaders commanding them, Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. They're like chalk and cheese. One was a spy during the Cold War, the other was a comedian on television. Today, both men are wartime leaders, two very different wartime leaders. Zelensky is operating from a bunker. He looks visibly tired, his eyes are swollen, his face is unshaven, and he's surrounded by his war cabinet. Even his attire has changed. On day 1 of the invasion, Zelensky turned up in a full suit. Now he's wearing a green t-shirt. Compare that to Vladimir Putin. He's operating from one of the most secure buildings in the world, the Kremlin. His war cabinet sits at the other end of hilariously long tables. Chances are he's also stressed, but Putin knows better than to show it. Both men operate very differently. This week, we saw Zelensky making videos on the streets of Kiev. He was rallying his people from the ground. You won't see Putin do that. He's confident of his army's discipline. He makes carefully choreographed appearances on state television. Thursday was the perfect example of both styles. Zelensky and Putin both addressed press conferences. Let's begin with the Russian president. His talking points were mostly predictable. So was his style. Putin basically said, everything is going to plan.
I will never give up my conviction that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. Even though some people in Ukraine have been intimidated, many have been duped by Nazi and nationalist propaganda, but some have deliberately gone the way of Banderites and other Nazi henchmen. Dear comrades, I want to say that the special military operation is proceeding strictly in line with the timetable. According to plan, all the tasks that have been set are being successfully resolved.
Zelensky's presser was more emotional. The president was a roller coaster of sentiments. He was passionate, he was resolute. At the same time, you could sense the helplessness in his voice. This was a leader stuck between two massive forces, a Russia that refuses to back down and a NATO that refuses to dirty its hands.
What do you want from us? Go away from our land. You don't want to leave now? Sit down with me at the negotiation table. I am available. Sit with me, but not at 30 meters, like you welcomed Macron and Scholz and others. I am your neighbor. You don't need to keep me at 30-meter distance. I don't bite. I am a normal man. Sit down with me. Let's talk. What are you afraid of?
Sentiments aside, what's the story here? In one word, propaganda. Many expected Russia to win the narrative war, but they did not. All over social media, Ukraine is dominating news. Their president is the hero, their people are pillars of resilience, and their cities are fortresses. How did that happen? Because Russia's propaganda machine is from the 20th century. It is based on state media outlets. And you cannot build narratives with state media. Just think about it. The Russian Defense Ministry is pushing videos through RT and Sputnik. Meanwhile, Zelensky is vlogging from Kiev. Which one would you watch? Exactly. Plus, Ukraine's government does not have to stage manage their media because most journalists are already calling Russia out. Not the case in Moscow, though. Putin is muzzling independent voices in his country, leading to incidents like this one.
I want to say that today we had a staff meeting. Someone was in the office, someone in Zoom, and we were making a decision what to do next. And it was the hardest decision of our lives. We have decided to temporarily halt the work of the TV channel. I want to say that the word temporarily is important here. We need some time and some strength to breathe and understand how to carry on working.
That was one of Russia's last independent channels. First, their website was blocked. Now they have shut down broadcasts. The fact is, Putin is having a hard time controlling the narrative. So what is his plan? A last roll of the dice. Russian state media is switching to all-out offensive. They claim Zelensky has fled Ukraine. Their parliament has introduced a new law. Jail time for fake news. Now, we agree that fake news is bad. But what constitutes fake news? That the Russian government will decide. Sort of like a tit for tat. The West banned Russia Today and Sputnik. Now, Russia has blocked websites of the BBC and Voice of America. Also, Putin is using foreign nationals to build his propaganda, specifically Indian nationals stuck in Ukraine. Listen to what he said on Thursday.
And they are taking hostage foreign citizens, including thousands of students, those who went to college in Ukraine for more than one day. At the train station in Kharkiv, 3,179 Indian citizens were held prisoner there. And they're still there. Most of them are still there, including 576 people in Sumy.
Putin says 3,000 Indian students were held back at railway stations. Basically, they were held hostage. Is he speaking the truth? The government of India says it has received no such report. New Delhi also lauded Ukraine for their help. But Putin is not giving up. He has returned with more claims. Russia now says it is readying 130 buses to evacuate Indians from Kharkiv and Sumy. Again, we cannot verify this claim. For starters, Russia does not control Kharkiv. It does not know where these Indian students are. So these claims must be taken with a pinch of salt. And not just the Russian claims, even Ukrainian ones. Zelensky says 5,000 Russian soldiers have been killed so far. I'll give you some context. America lost 4,400 troops in Iraq, and that included the invasion and the occupation. We are also hearing reports of assassination attempts on Zelensky. Ukraine says they foiled 3 attempts this week. 3 assassination attempts in 7 days. How did they manage that? Ukraine says they were tipped off by anti-war elements in the Russian spy agency. Again, these claims are too good to be true. The fact is, every war has one truth. You can see that truth when the war breaks out, and after that, the truth disappears. All you see is propaganda. In this war, that truth is clear. Vladimir Putin unleashed this tragedy. And I have to say this. The world is watching this war through a myopic lens. We're seeing Ukrainian cities being bombed. We're seeing Ukrainian towns being leveled. Ukrainians resisting the invasion. Ukrainians fleeing the war. Ukrainian fathers crying as they bid goodbye to their children and partners. What about the Russians? Ever wondered where they are in this story? This war is between 2 countries, Ukraine and Russia. Now, we know what's happening in Ukraine, but nothing about how this war is affecting the Russians. This is partly because of the bias of Western media and partly because Russia is not giving the world a glimpse into its towns and cities. Earlier this week, we saw Russians protesting the war and then being arrested for staging anti-war protests. And that's about it. Not a word on the effects of the war, not a word on the effects of sanctions and the sinking economy. There is a story in this silence, and many Russians are now telling this story to the world. A journalist based in Russia put out this Twitter thread. He says he has left Russia, that there are reports of a possible martial law, even border closures. Now, first things first, what is a martial law? In simple terms, martial law means military control. When a country declares martial law, it hands over the charge of running the country to the military. Armed forces become in charge of the day-to-day affairs. The ordinary rule of law is suspended, and so are your civil rights. Now, why does Russia need martial law? Perhaps to crack down on protesters or to silence those opposing the war, maybe even shut down social media, bring the country under one roof as it intensifies the attack on Ukraine. Reports say Russia's parliament is convening an emergency session. A martial law could follow soon. Russians are petrified. This journalist says people are fleeing the country, tickets are sold out, flights are packed. That's because people are scared to be trapped in Russia or to be sent to the war zone. There are also fears of conscription or compulsory military service. It is already happening in Ukraine. Men of a certain age are not being able to leave the country. They have been told to stay back and fight, whether they like it or not. Kiev has declared martial law. Moscow could follow suit. This fear and uncertainty is just one part of the story. Russians are also suffering economically. The war has put their entire life savings in jeopardy. Today, a Russian ruble is worth less than a cent. Food inflation has exceeded 12.5%. Interest rates have doubled. Analysts predict these numbers will continue to get worse. In short, while Ukrainians are hiding in bomb shelters, this war is bleeding Russians too. Meanwhile, the rich in Russia are said to be panic buying. What are they buying? Reports say they're hoarding luxury goods. Jewelry and luxury watches have become the investment of choice. And Bulgari has become the go-to brand. Since this war began, there has been an increase in their jewelry sale, unlike a lot of Western brands that stopped operations in Russia. Bulgari, Cartier, Rolex and Omega are still selling, and rich Russians are betting big on these brands. The hope is that these products can bring them high resale value, or at least hold their value, unlike the tumbling Russian ruble. And since we're discussing rich Russians, how could we not talk about Russian oligarchs, the ones facing sanctions? A total of 19 Russian oligarchs have been sanctioned by the West so far. They're said to have lost more than $80 billion in wealth, mostly due to asset seizures and financial penalties. Who are these individuals? How much influence do they wield in Russia? And will the sanctions make them go against Putin? Here's a report.
It's not the best of times to be a Russian oligarch. Putin's invasion has made them targets of Western sanctions. Their assets are being frozen. Their fortunes are dwindling. Before we tell you how, you must know who these oligarchs really are. Russian business tycoons who've amassed billions in personal wealth by leveraging their connections to the Kremlin. Most of them rose to prominence in the 1990s, thanks to vast privatization and economic reforms that followed the disintegration of the Soviet Union. 3 decades on, they're being sanctioned for the war in Ukraine. Why? To hurt the Russian economy and put pressure on Putin. Topping the sanctions list is Igor Sechin, the CEO of state-backed Rosneft, one of the largest oil companies in the world. Sechin is one of Putin's most trusted and close advisors. Often called the second most powerful Russian, he reportedly earns $4.7 million per year and owns assets worth billions abroad. He now stands to lose most of these. He's already lost his super yacht, the 280-foot Amor Velo. France has seized it. Next on the list is Nikolai Tokarev, the CEO of state-controlled Transneft, one of the largest oil pipeline companies in the world. He served in the KGB alongside Putin, and is also one of his longtime friends. Next we have Alisher Usmanov, an Uzbek-born Russian businessman, often said to be Putin's favorite oligarch. With an estimated net worth of $19.5 billion, Germany has seized his $600 million yacht. Number 4 on the sanction list is Peter Avin, the biggest shareholder in the Alpha Group, the owner of Russia's largest private bank, with an estimated net worth of $5.3 billion. He's also a trustee in numerous European institutions, like the Royal Academy in London, which has now asked him to step down. In the 5th spot is Mikhail Friedman, the founder of Alpha Group, the financier and enabler of Putin's inner circle. He owned a 50% stake in the London-based investment firm Letter One. He's now been forced to step down from its board of directors. His assets have been frozen. His rights as shareholder have been taken away. Letter One's employees have been forbidden from speaking to him. These were the big fish. Other names include businessman Sergei Roldugan. He was once accused of shuffling $2 billion for Putin through offshore companies. Peter Fradkov, who is said to provide financial support to the Russian defense sector, and Gennady Timchenko, the founder of Volga Group, whose fortune has fallen from $22 billion to $11 billion due to sanctions. In total, 19 oligarchs, along with 47 of their family members and associates, have been sanctioned. They've lost $80 billion in wealth. Some have broken ranks with the Kremlin and called for an end to Russia's war with Ukraine. As the sanctions intensify, it will be interesting to see if they continue to support Putin.
In many ways, this war has been a flashback of the last century. Tanks rolling through Europe, cities under constant shelling, two nuclear powers pitted against each other. Even for India, this was a flashback. Last time Russia and America locked horns, India was non-aligned. Now that playbook has returned. India has refused to pick sides in this war. It has abstained thrice at the United Nations. If you ask social media, India should have been more decisive. But the fact is, diplomacy is a subtle art. It's all about reading between the lines. India did call for an immediate end to violence. India also emphasized on sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that's not the same as supporting Russia. How does the US see India's position? For starters, there is no hostility. And that was not the case during the Cold War. Back then, America was very suspicious of non-alignment. Washington had a black and white approach. You're either with us or against us. But this time around, that's not the case. No public criticism, no snide remarks. Washington has been understanding of India's position. Let me quote what the State Department spokesman said. We share important interests with India. We share important values with India. We know India has a relationship with Russia that is distinct from the relationship that we have with Russia. Of course, that is okay. So what changed? Did the US become mature? Or did India's strategic importance grow? Chances are it's the second one. The US needs India's help to tackle Chinese aggression. Without India, there is no Quad. No grand strategies in the Indo-Pacific. And Joe Biden realizes this. Earlier this week, the State Department's top official in South and Central Asia was grilled by the Senate. As expected, the focus was on India. Why does New Delhi buy so many weapons from Russia? Is India dependent on Russian hardware? Here's what the official replied.
I would say that that is a relationship of the Cold War, just as our very deep relationship and alliance with Pakistan was so critical during the Cold War years. But I would argue of the major defense systems acquired over the past decade, the majority of the major defense systems have been American, European, Israeli. They've come from a diversity of countries.
The State Department has numbers too. They claim India has reduced Russian arms imports by 53% since 2011. They also claim that India cancelled orders of Russian weapons in the last few weeks, a few MiG-21s, helicopters and anti-tank artillery. What has the government of India said? So far, there's been no response to the State Department's claim. But here's a bigger question. Is America underestimating the depth of India's relationship with Russia? It definitely seems like it. Yes, India has reduced arms imports from Russia. But that is part of diversification, not decoupling. Even beyond weapons, Russia remains an important partner. To access Central Asia, India needs Russia. To contain China, India needs Russia. So weapons is just one part of a broad relationship. There are cultural ties, economic prospects, joint manufacturing projects. The US is discounting all of this. It wants India to abandon its dependence on Russian weapons. It wants India to condemn Russian aggression. But remember, that is America's self-interest. What about India's interest? Balancing Russia and America is key to Indian foreign policy, and until now, both sides have understood that. Russia never went ballistic over the Quad. America never sanctioned India over purchasing Russian weapons. Will Ukraine change that equation? Well, technically, Joe Biden can still impose CAATSA on India. That's countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act, CAATSA, a law that punishes countries that buy Russian weapons. Now, Joe Biden was reportedly considering a waiver for India. But there could be a rethink now. The State Department says the final decision will be taken by the president. For India, this controversy means one thing, a reaffirmation of New Delhi's strategic importance. Both Russia and America want India's support. Putin is using propaganda to lure India. Biden is deploying his entire diplomatic machinery. Listen in.
I want to describe a pitched battle we've been having. Secretary Blinken has been on the front lines of that battle. The president, other senior officials in the State Department have been relentlessly conducting a very serious high-level dialogue with our Indian counterparts over Ukraine over the course of months now, but culminating in this past week. We can already see an evolution in some of India's public position.
Diplomatic efforts are fine, but the US must remember one thing. Coercive measures will backfire. Any strategic rethink must be based on India's own interests. So Washington has a big decision to make. Russia or China? Ukraine or India? I know it sounds like a heartless choice, but that's politics for you. We'll wrap with that. Leave you with Gravitas images. Thanks very much for watching. Stay safe.